The famous Greek historian Demosthenes wrote in 338 BC, "He who fights and flees lives to fight again." The hero of our story persistently embodies this maxim in an extraordinary way, and a millennium and a half before Demosthenes was born. A high-ranking courtier, a nobleman, a patron of the arts, and a brilliant warrior. This is the story of Sinuhe, one of the oldest recorded narratives in human history. The year is 1962 BC. The great pharaoh Amenemhat I lies dead in his palace. He was the first ruler of the 12th dynasty of Egypt. He came to power after serving as vizier under Mentuhotep IV, but the question of exactly how he came to occupy the throne remains controversial. Some historians believe that he usurped power due to the lack of a legitimate successor to his predecessor. Others argue that he seized the throne because his predecessor was considered a weak ruler. Whatever his motive, we will never know for sure. What we do know is that Pharaoh Amenemhat I established the dynasty that ushered in the Middle Kingdom. He ruled for 30 years, during which time he expanded Egypt's borders through military campaigns in Nubia and southern Canaan. He also began large-scale building projects, including the construction of his pyramid at El-Lisht and fortifications along Egypt's borders. Going back to that fateful moment by the pharaoh's deathbed, there stood Sinuhe, a person whose life was about to take an unexpected direction that even he himself could not have imagined. Sinuhe was a high-ranking official in Pharaoh's court, probably holding a position related to the royal harem or acting as an envoy. During the reign of Pharaoh Amenemhat I, his life was not just good, it was wonderful. He fed from gold utensils, wore the finest linen, and had direct access to the most powerful ruler in the land. His name weighed heavily in the palace, and his influence was considerable. But if history has taught us anything, it is that power is ephemeral and can be taken away at any moment. And that is exactly what happened to Sinuhe, just not in the way one would expect. After Pharaoh's death, chaos ensued in the court. Throughout the palace, there were whispers of traitors lurking among their own ranks. Sinuhe had nothing to do with Pharaoh's death, but in such times, innocence is a weak shield. He was close to the royal family, too close. He had witnessed some important things, had heard words that should not have reached his ears. Everything he knew could make enemies of allies. And in a time of transition, anyone could become a target. But Sinuhe knew very well how such stories played out. Power struggles, silent betrayals, sudden disappearances. One could fall asleep in a palace and wake up in a tomb. Added to all this, he had enemies, men who envied his position and influence, and when a powerful ruler like Amenemhat I dies, someone always has to be blamed. It was at this point that Sinuhe felt extremely insecure and threatened. It was as if thousands of eyes were watching him. He began to notice strange maneuvers and rumors in the court. Immediately, he knew that his life was in danger. So he made the only possible choice a man in his position could make: disappear before the gates were locked and they came for him. He flees into the night, deftly sneaking past the city walls. Now the desert stretches before him, endless and unforgiving. But he is not frightened and runs as fast as his legs can carry him. And not out of guilt, but out of pure survival instinct. Because in the end, a man's life is worth nothing if he cannot preserve it himself. The days flowed into each other. Time began to lose its meaning. Egypt was already far behind. Sinuhe's body screamed at him for rest, but he knew the desert did not forgive the weak. He didn't stop to gather refuse, to search for food, to pray, and then to curse the gods. And just when he thought he would become another nameless skeleton buried beneath the sands, he stumbled upon the land of Retinue, what we now call Syria. It seems fate had not yet abandoned him. Exhausted, hungry, and mad with thirst, he fainted on the border of a foreign land. It was there that a group of Bedouin nomads found him. They sheltered him, restored his strength, and gave him food, water, and a place to rest. But a stranger in a strange land is never completely safe. They watched him with curiosity and suspicion. Who was he? Why had he fled Egypt? What secrets did he carry with him? The first rule of the wilderness is this: A careless tongue can be deadlier even than the edge of a sword. Sinuhe knew this very well, so he spoke little, but words travel fast, even across sand dunes. Word of his presence reached Amunenshi, a powerful ruler of Regan. He was a warlike leader, a man the people both feared and respected, a king in all but name. He summoned the Egyptian to his court, and when such a mighty man summons you, refusal is tantamount to death. And so Sinuhe went. When he arrived at the majestic palace in the midst of the wildlands, Amunenshi eyed him carefully with a sharp, penetrating gaze. Then, surprisingly, he smiled and said, "You are no ordinary Egyptian. I see how you behave. You have stood in the halls of kings." And he was right. No matter how far he had run, he could not hide the royal imprint that had been left on him. And Amunenshi, for his part, was a man who knew what was valuable when he saw it. In his eyes, Sinuhe was no mere outcast. He was a weapon. That was why he made him an offer to take his place among his warriors. A life filled with honor, power, and wealth. And what choice did he really have? Egypt was lost. His past was dead. But here was a chance to be reborn. And so, with open arms and gratitude, he accepted. Now, he was fighting for Amunenshi. He led his armies into battle, and let it be known, he was good at it. The desert tempers a man, and Sinuhe becomes fearsome. He had lands, a wife, and children. No longer was Sinuhe the exile. Now, he was Sinuhe, the warrior. The year is 1942 BC. 20 years have passed since Sinuhe fled into exile. His hair had turned gray with time, but he had built something here, something real. Still, something was missing. At night he dreamed of the Nile, the temples, and the golden sands of his homeland. He'd fled to save his life, but in doing so, he'd lost something much greater, his soul. And then, one day, word arrived. A royal messenger, an Egyptian. He bore the seal of Pharaoh Senusret I, son of the same king whose death had caused Sinuhe to flee among the sands so many years before. His heart constricted as he read the letter. Pharaoh Senusret I knew of him, knew that he had fled and that he had spent his life in exile. But he did not seek his head. He didn't. He was offering him something completely unexpected: forgiveness. For the first time in decades, the weight of the past relaxed its grip on his shoulders. He could finally go home. But there was one problem. His return wasn't so simple. Amunenshi had given him everything. Was she going to let him go just like that? And with that question, all his euphoria evaporated. He was between the hammer and the anvil. But one could never know what was in another's heart until one asked. And so Sinuhe stood before the warlord in his great hall and told him of her intentions to return home. For a long time, the ruler said nothing. Then, to Sinuhe's surprise, he laughed and said, "I always knew this day would come, Sinuhe. One cannot run away from one's homeland forever." And just like that, he let it go. No war, no betrayal, just an understanding between two men who have lived long enough to know that home is a part of you, no matter how far you run. And so, Sinuhe returned to Egypt. Pharaoh Senusret I welcomed him as a hero returning home. He gave him back his status and honor. Even in his old age, he was given a place among the nobles of Egypt. He was also given a tomb among the great, a place of eternal rest, worthy of one who had walked the edge of the world and returned. His story was recorded for posterity. It has become one of the oldest tales ever told. A story of fear, of destiny, of exile and return. A story of a man running from his past, only to find that the past was always waiting for him. Every life, no matter when it is lived, is a great adventure. But have you ever wondered what happens after it's over? What happens to us as soon as we take our last breath? Well, it seems an ancient and mysterious book has the answers to these questions, and you can learn them in the video you see to the left.